So around here at the Cobwebs channel, we love vampire movies. And today I want to talk to you about what is one of the greatest vampire movies, but also one of the most game-changing and groundbreaking vampire films in the history of cinema. I'm talking about Horror of Dracula from 1958. And this isn't just a review, this is the kickoff to the review series for the Cobwebs channel Halloween season 2024 on the Hammer Dracula films. Let's get into it. Thank you for tuning into the Cobwebs channel, everyone. My name is Daniel, and I welcome you to my house. And yeah, I am just so excited to talk about Horror of Dracula. Not just one of the greatest vampire movies, I think this is one of the greatest movies ever made. Absolutely one of my top favorites. The first film in Hammer's Dracula series, which would turn out to be their most prolific and their biggest franchise that they did. You see, Hammer had been around for a long time, but they really got put on the map in 1957 when they released their version of The Curse of Frankenstein, and they kicked off their whole run of gothic horror films. To this day, that is still primarily what they're known for. And the next year, of course, they went from Frankenstein to Dracula with the same director, Terence Fisher, the same writer, Jimmy Sangster, and the same stars, Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. It was originally released in England just under the name Dracula, but when it went over to the States, they changed the name to Horror of Dracula, so it'd be less confusing with the Bela Lugosi film from 1931. And I have always called it Horror of Dracula. That's what it'll always be to me. It differentiates itself from not just the Lugosi movie, but the Frank Langella movie from 1979, the Coppola movie from 1992. There's a lot of movies called Dracula, so I'm thankful this is something different, and Horror of Dracula. It just goes so well with Curse of Frankenstein.
This is the story of Dracula, a creature who destroys all whom he touches. How do you destroy a fiend who has so far proven himself indestructible?
So the movie opens up with some unbelievable theme music by James Bernard. I think the score to Horror of Dracula, it stands up with John Carpenter's score for Halloween, the score for Nightmare on Elm Street, The Exorcist. I think this is one of the greatest horror scores of all time. And the story about it that I find so interesting is that the main riff of this that James Bernard came up with is the syllables for Dracula. Dracula. You know, it's a lot like what John Williams did for his Superman theme, where it's da 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 Superman. It's a lot like that, but you know, a lot more gothic and spooky. And it is so awesome. It gets this movie pumped up right from the start. And I love this opening credit sequence going over Castle Dracula and leading up to his coffin with his name on it, blood dripping on it. The blood dripping on his name is actually really significant because this is one of the things that makes this movie so groundbreaking for vampire movies. This is the first one with blood. There had never been visible blood in a vampire movie before this. If you watch the Bela Lugosi film, which I'm going to be comparing this movie to a lot, and I want to make it clear, I love Todd Browning's Dracula from 1931 starring Bela Lugosi. It's one of the most important movies to my childhood, and I love it to this day. But man, this movie just kicks that movie up a notch in so many different ways. And we're going to get to that. And that film never shows vampire teeth. It never shows blood. It never shows Dracula actually bite everyone. And man, does this movie just ramp up all those factors into the stratosphere. And it's a big deal. Now, unlike that Bela Lugosi film, we do actually open up the film with Jonathan Harker, like the book, instead of Renfield. And Jonathan Harker here is played by John Van Eysen. And I got to say, right from the start, he is my favorite Harker of all time. I love the character of Jonathan Harker throughout different adaptations and the book and everything, but he is traditionally kind of a pathetic and kind of dumb character. In John Van Eysen's version, not only does he come across very intelligent from the start, but as we find out, there's a lot more to him than any Jonathan Harker we've seen before or since. It also opens up with his narration like he's writing a letter, which is a nice little homage to the book. We skip him arriving at the village and just cut to him arriving at Castle Dracula all alone because it's during the day and nobody is there to greet him. But later that night, who shows up but Christopher Lee as Dracula? Now, Christopher Lee is so iconic in the role of Dracula, but let's really break this entrance down, okay? Because I actually think it's pretty darn interesting. Now, when he first shows up, I mean, we get this great sting of James Bernard's music. It's epic. We see him in the shadows at the top of a staircase. It's very spooky. But that moment is quickly subverted, I think very interestingly, by director Terrence Fisher, where he then just comes down the stairs very calmly.
Mr. Harker, I'm glad that you've arrived safely.
And he doesn't come across scary or foreign.
I must apologize for not being here to greet you personally, but I trust that you have found everything you needed.
Thank you, sir.
He speaks with a clear British accent, sounds very prim and proper, welcomes him to his house, and everything seems normal. This is a departure from the book and definitely from the Bela Lugosi film and from Nosferatu from 1922, because usually Dracula comes across extremely foreign, whether it's just because of the accent with Bela Lugosi or because he truly looks like some monstrous creature that's just been holed up in a corner of Romania away from civilization for hundreds of years, like Max Schreck in Nosferatu. And we look at films after this, I mean, Gary Oldman and Coppola's Dracula, he just seems very strange. And this movie just does not do that. There's not even any kind of Transylvanian accent. He just sounds British. On one hand, I think this is because Christopher Lee probably didn't want to do any other kind of accent. I've never heard Christopher Lee do anything but a British accent, and I've seen Christopher Lee in a lot of movies, but you may correct me. Maybe he pretends to be American or Transylvanian in something else. But it could also be because this Dracula is just better at drawing people in and appearing as he knows they want him to appear. Now, unlike in the book where Jonathan Harker is coming to sell Dracula some real estate in England, he's actually coming as a librarian to organize Dracula's library. But that is quickly revealed to be just a ruse, and he's really a vampire hunter working with Dr. Van Helsing, and he is there on a mission to kill Dracula, or as he says in the movie, to end his reign of terror, which is awesome. And I love this take on Harker. It just takes away how dumb he is in so many other different versions. He's kind of badass in this. And like I said, this is the best version of the character, I think. This was a great idea. And it's right about this point where he meets somebody else in the castle, not just Dracula, but a beautiful young woman in a flowing white gown, played by Valerie Gaunt. And here we get our Dracula bride of the film. And unlike in many other versions of Dracula, including the Lugosi film, there isn't three brides, there's just one. And it's cool to see Valerie Gaunt in this because she did play the maid in Curse of Frankenstein for Hammer just the year before. And she's very, very good. She doesn't immediately appear spooky, but as somebody who desperately needs help and convinces Harker, or seemingly convinces him, that she is just being held hostage and she needs his help. But no, she is a vampire bride and she's there to bite him, and she might have just been successful. But here we get, I mean, one of the greatest scenes in the movie, but also just one of the greatest scenes ever in any movie, where Dracula shows up, and here his entire pretension about pretending to not be a blood-sucking vampiric monster is completely gone. He shows up, eyes glowing, teeth jagged, blood flowing down his mouth. And like I said, I've got to put you into the mindset of 1958, okay? This did not happen in vampire movies. This is new. This is totally new ground. And I think we've just got to give it so much credit. All of these things making this vampire, this horrific beast, is so great. But I've got to give Christopher Lee some extra credit because there's a lot of other takes on Dracula where he does turn into a literal horrific beast, like in the Francis Ford Coppola version, where he takes the form of a wolf and a bat monster and stuff. Or if you even look at, like, Fright Night, Jerry Dandridge is kind of a Dracula stand-in. There, his face turns into this literal monstrous face. Here, all Christopher Lee needs is sharp teeth, red contacts, which apparently were extremely uncomfortable, and I don't doubt it, and blood dripping out of the mouth. And he is so phenomenal at playing a vampire that he appears like one of the most monstrous, horrific things you've ever seen, and that's all he needs. Like, I mean, he might be the greatest actor to ever play a vampire, like the most convincing at being a vampire. I mean, other than Max Schreck, who was literally a vampire, right? We believe that, right? Don't we? I thought you did. Now, this little fight scene between Christopher Lee and Valerie Gaunt has got three of the greatest shots I've ever seen in a movie. This, and this. I mean, holy cow, can any scene possibly get more iconic? I mean, this movie might have it beat with a later scene, but we'll get there. And it turns out Jonathan Harker actually did get bitten by this vampire bride, and I think this really well establishes just how powerful vampires are in this movie, because our lead character dies real early on. I mean, he gets turned into a vampire. He is doomed. And by the way, we get this great moment where he actually successfully stakes the vampire bride, and it's a much more visceral staking, again, than we've ever seen in a vampire movie up to this point, complete with screaming and blood dripping and all that kind of good stuff. But Christopher Lee shows up at the door, showing Jonathan Harker is too late. Dracula has already risen, and he looks like your dad who caught you when you did something bad, and you just know the jig is up. Like, my life is over. I'm grounded for, well, forever in Jonathan Harker's case. I gotta wonder at this point, though, why did Dracula bring Jonathan Harker here? Like, did he actually bring him to catalog his library? Does this Dracula really care about his library being in good condition and being well organized, and he literally brought a librarian over? Or did he know and he kind of just wanted a challenge? He just wanted to kill a vampire hunter just for the sport of it. I kind of think it's the second one, especially since he reveals himself to be a vampire so quickly. I think he knows that, like, it doesn't matter. This guy knows anyway. But yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure. 24 minutes into this movie, we have a brand new protagonist, and it is Peter Cushing as Dr. Van Helsing, who shows up when his buddy Jonathan Harker never came back and comes to find out what happened. And here we get his interactions with the village people, which we were denied at the beginning of this with Jonathan Harker, so I'm glad we get it here, because in a Dracula movie, I love interactions with the village people where they're like, oh, there are horrible things going on in here, and Van Helsing's like, why are you hanging all these garlic flowers around? It's all just classic stuff for a Dracula movie. I love it. But this right here, this is another reason this is one of the greatest movies ever made. It's not just Christopher Lee's Dracula, which is perfection, but it is Peter Cushing as Van Helsing, who is the greatest Van Helsing, easily. Like, nothing else comes even close. Like, I really like Anthony Hopkins in the Coppola version. I'm not a big fan of Edward Van Sloan in the 1931 film, to be honest with you. But man, Peter Cushing is so awesome. Something I love about him is he never comes across like an overly superstitious guy who's just kind of listened to too many local legends. Like, he sounds like such an authority. And when he speaks about what vampires are, how you kill them, all this kind of stuff, it sounds so scientific, you completely believe him.
The study of these creatures has been my life's work. I've carried out research with some of the greatest authorities in Europe.
Like, he turns vampire hunting into a legit science. Peter Cushing is just so good at sounding perfectly credible. Plus, he just looks like a badass in this hat and this fur-collared coat. I just love his look in this. Apparently, NECA is releasing a figure of him soon, and I cannot wait to buy it. I gotta have Peter Cushing in this outfit on my shelf. Now, after Van Helsing discovers that Jonathan Harker did get turned into a vampire and he stakes him to finally give him peace, he goes back to visit Jonathan Harker's family, particularly Arthur Holmwood. This is very interesting when we go back to England. At least I assume it's England. They don't get super specific about locations in this movie. But who each character is and their relationships is really jumbled up from the book. And I gotta say, I really respect how writer Jimmy Sangster was able to condense this incredibly large book into the movie's like an hour and 23 minutes. And it is so perfectly paced. It never feels rushed at all. It never feels even slightly slow. There isn't a second of this movie wasted or even the least bit boring. So he just like streamlined this story so perfectly. Made a lot of changes, but they're all changes that really worked. Okay, but let's get started on sorting these characters. So while Arthur Holmwood is the fiance of Lucy in the book, here he is the husband of Mina and the brother of Lucy. And Lucy is engaged to Jonathan Harker instead of Mina being engaged to Jonathan Harker like in the book. And Mina is, Arthur Holmwood's wife instead of, so it's all kind of mixed up. I don't really know why they switched particularly Lucy and Mina's names. I think it would have been kind of easy just to keep Mina with, I'm getting mixed up here. Mina with Harker, keep Lucy with Holmwood. But I guess they just want Mina to be the final girl like she typically is, and that's kind of what they needed for the story. So, I get it, and it works fine enough. But this is interesting here. We find out that Dracula actually beat Van Helsing to this location and has already started drinking the blood of Lucy. She's already under his spell, and we get this great scene where this is revealed, where she is opening up her window, her curtains, lying in bed, exposing her neck expectedly until Dracula shows up at her window. This movie also really ramps up the attraction that women clearly feel to Dracula and to being bitten. That's a big deal for the vampire genre as well, because that will become that. It's not that that wasn't at all in the Lugosi film. There's hints of it, but it gets a lot more explicit with this film. But yeah, why is Dracula there? Well, they never explicitly say it, but I think he's there to get a replacement for his vampire bride that Jonathan Harker killed, but also kind of wants to get revenge against Jonathan Harker for killing his bride by taking one of his women. You know, he starts out with Lucy, Harker's fiance, and then he's going to move on to, let's see, trying to get character relationships here. Harker's brother-in-law's wife, basically. Van Helsing figures out pretty quickly that Lucy is definitely being fed on by Dracula and commands that she has got to keep all of her windows and doors shut at night, and takes this very seriously and hangs up garlic flowers. By the way, I kind of like this idea that Dracula is stopped by windows and doors being closed. You know, it kind of adds to the folklore of it. The whole cannot enter unless invited in. It's pretty cool. And I just love how Van Helsing handles all these situations. Like, I think what I love the most about Van Helsing is he's incredibly polite, an incredibly nice guy, but very assertive and take charge when he needs to. He's kind of like Dalton from Roadhouse. I bet you weren't expecting a Roadhouse reference in this video, were you? I wasn't either. It literally just popped in my head. But, you know, Van Helsing believes strongly, be nice until it is time to not be nice.
I want you to be nice until it's time to not be nice.
There. You look like a teddy bear now. Will you wear this pretty thing?
I don't know what you're talking about.
I think you do. And I think you know something about my friend.
Another thing we get here in this movie for the first time in a Dracula film is a ghostly, dead vampire Lucy, because she's dead at this point, just wandering around the garden. And that becomes very important for Dracula films, and this is a really good version of it. Just lots of fog, and she's talking to this child, because there's a kid in this movie, by the way. A new creation for this film. She's actually the daughter of the housekeeper, which a lot of people don't understand on their first watch. I think I used to be confused by it too. She's not Arthur and Mina's kid, she's the housekeeper's kid. But Lucy trying to draw in this child, much the way like the vampire brides feed on a baby in the original book. Very, very spooky. And upon seeing vampire Lucy and helping Van Helsing actually stake her, in which another visceral staking scene, blood dripping out of her, she's screaming while it's happening. You also, right before this, get her head being burned by a crucifix, which is awesome. Arthur, of course, becomes converted to the idea that, yeah, there are vampires. By the way, in case you thought Arthur looked familiar, yes, that is Michael Gough, who would play Alfred in all the old 80s, 90s Batman movies. He was actually pretty frequently in old gothic horror films around this time period, including for Hammer. So I think he's great in this movie, and I really enjoy him as like Van Helsing's vampire hunting buddy. He's really anti all these ideas of vampire stuff at the beginning, but once he gets converted, he just becomes like super hungry for knowledge and picking Van Helsing's brain on like what vampires are, how do they work, and I really like those scenes.
I always understood that if there were such things, they could change themselves into bats or wolves.
That's a common fallacy.
Which is interesting. It's funny that they take that part of the mythos away, and I'm trying to remember now if Dracula ever does turn into a bat or a wolf in some of the future sequels. I don't remember off the top of my head that ever happening, but we'll find out in our future reviews of these sequels over the next couple of months. But I do wonder if for this movie at least they took that stance so they wouldn't ever have to do some kind of hokey bat effect, because bat effects never looked good in this time period. And I respect that. This movie doesn't go for any special effects that they can't pull off well. So at this point in the movie, Arthur and Van Helsing are traveling around trying to locate Dracula's coffin, and Mina is getting pulled under Dracula's spell right under their nose. And there's this epic scene that I have to acknowledge, where Dracula shows up at Mina's room when she's alone, and he corners her into her room and shuts the door. And under the rules of like older vampire movies, you would expect that's where the scene ends. It's just suggested that he bites her, but instead the camera cuts to inside the room and he corners her over to her bed. She lies down, and it's very sexual, especially for the 1950s. And it just gets more so because then he grabs her head, he rubs his face all over her face. It's a very sexy, romantic moment before he then goes in for the bite. This is very significant because vampires had never been sexual like this before, and Christopher Lee just ramps it up. And I just think this is like one of the most important moments in all of vampire history, because vampires now are very commonly known to be sexy. I mean, there's so many TV shows that revolve all around that. True Blood and The Vampire Diaries and Twilight, all about falling in love with vampires. And so much of that doesn't completely originate with Christopher Lee, but he really ramps it up. And I think a huge part of it does originate here with Christopher Lee. There's another moment right after this that, man, I just love so much. We don't actually see Dracula carry Mina out of the house, but instead we get Gerda, the housekeeper's reaction to it. And it is so awesome. Like, she so believably, just authentically, is screaming bloody murder about whatever she saw. And when they come question her, and she says that Dracula carried Mina off, she screams, again with full conviction, he looked like the devil.
You said I must come back to Madam, so I came up here, and he looked like the devil.
Now, what happened?
That's one of those moments that makes Christopher Lee so impactful in this movie, even though he is not in it much. Apparently, he's in this movie for about 7 minutes. Now, I didn't watch this movie with a timer, kind of timing it myself. I just did a Google. So according to what I could find on the internet, he's on screen for 7 minutes, which I believe is just a little bit less than Robert Englund is on screen for A Nightmare on Elm Street. But it's moments like this that to where like it cements his legacy. He doesn't need it. When she screams, he looked like the devil. You believe it. From what you've seen from Christopher Lee previous to this, you believe that without him even changing his form into some kind of bat monster or anything like that, he looks like the devil himself. And that is what makes Christopher Lee so special as this character. So through some events, Van Helsing and Holmwood figure out where Dracula is, and they're able to chase him back to his castle. And we've got to talk about this epic, I've been saying the word epic a lot, but I just got to with this movie, this epic confrontation between Dracula and Van Helsing. And this is where Van Helsing is turned into like an action hero. And he had never been anything like that before. But Peter Cushing is so physical in this movie. Like, I did theater in high school, and one thing that's taught a lot in theater is moving with purpose. Like when you're acting on stage, you wouldn't like raise your hand like this. You'd raise your hand like this, like you would move with purpose. And you see that from Peter Cushing all through this movie. Like, he's a very physical actor. And when he is chasing down Dracula, he is very intense. He's fighting him off. And there is this awesome moment where he runs across the tables, leaps at the curtains, and pulls them down, revealing the sunlight at Dracula. And we've got to talk about this method for killing Dracula, because it's not the first time it had been done. Actually, the whole idea of vampires getting destroyed by sunlight, killed by sunlight, actually comes from Nosferatu from 1922, when the sunlight hits Max Schreck and he disappears. So it had been done, but he just fades away in that. It had never been done viscerally like this before, and sunlight had never burned a vampire on screen. And that Christopher Lee plays it so well, just the screaming, the suffering he clearly feels by being hit by the sun. And he does get slowly disintegrated into ash. Again, that's a big deal for this genre. Like that idea originated with this movie, and sunlight killing vampires had just never been done up to this level before. So let's go ahead and rate Horror of Dracula. Now for atmosphere, I'm going to give this movie a 10. I think it's absolutely perfect. Whether you got Dracula's castle, you've got foggy graveyards, back in England inside like Lucy's room with the billowing curtains from the large open door window thing, French doors, I think they're called, where Dracula comes up to it. Like, everything about the atmosphere in this movie is absolutely perfect. I could not ask for more. Now for characters, I'm going to give this another 10. I mean, first of all, you've got Dracula. And while I actually don't think this is Christopher Lee's best performance as Dracula in the series, I think that's in a movie that's yet to come. I mean, still, like, you can't really ask for more. Like, he's so great in this movie. This is my favorite version of Jonathan Harker. Easily my favorite version of Van Helsing. I mean, he's my favorite monster hunter in any movie ever. So obviously, like, he would get it to a 10 all on his own. But I really like Homewood. I really like Mina. I even Gerda and her kid. Like, every character in this movie is perfect, except for maybe the messenger boy that comes to bring Mina a message and he's terribly dubbed.
Arthur Homewood, he calls himself. Said you'd know him.
My husband's gone to Ingstad.
Not if he gave me this message, he hasn't.
We're not going to count him as part of this. This is a 10 out of 10. Now, for story, I mean, I'm also going to give this a 10. I just have to. Like, again, I am so impressed by how Jimmy Sanctor is able to condense this story down perfectly and just make it flow perfectly. It never feels like it's missing anything. It never feels like it doesn't have quite enough. Whereas I think, again, I love the Bela Lugosi version from 1931. But that version, it doesn't do that in the best possible way. It does feel like it's kind of missing things. It does feel like you could use a little bit more to kind of spice up the runtime. And this movie, you never feel that. Like, it feels like the story is perfect from start to finish. Like, there's no holes. Everything works. And then for scares, I'm going to give this an 8. I actually don't think this is the absolute peak in the series for this category. And also, like, I don't personally find this movie scary. I mean, come on, that's not really why I watch it. I watch it much more because, one, it's a great movie, and two, it's a totally cozy comfort movie for me. But you gotta give it credit for its time, right? I mean, the teeth, the blood, the glowing red eyes. He looked like the devil. Like, it is such a step up for vampire movies for its time. And I do think if you want to go into a movie for some spooky, scary content, this movie's going to give it to you, like, hands down. So all in all, even though that scare category isn't quite a 10, Horror of Dracula gets a 10 out of 10. It is a perfect movie, I think. And, you know, I have a couple of ranking lists on this channel where I have ranked The Curse of Frankenstein over Horror of Dracula. I've always said Curse of Frankenstein is my favorite Hammer movie, but I don't know. After this rewatch, it might be Horror of Dracula. Like, I think it actually might be the better movie. It was better reviewed when it came out, I'll tell you that. This was not received well at the time. This was received very, very well for the time. So, Horror of Dracula, it might actually be my favorite Hammer movie. So what do you think about this movie? Please let me know down in the comments below. And if you want more Hammer Dracula reviews, definitely subscribe because I got more coming on the way in the next couple of months. And if you are curious for my thoughts on Curse of Frankenstein, here's my review for that, as well as my playlist of all of my other Hammer content. But with all that said, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it. Make sure you take some time to enjoy this Halloween season today, and I will see you next time.